It was just after midnight, when the silence of a small Alabama town was broken by a sound no one could forget. A scream, brief, sharp, and then gone, echoed across the darkened streets. Neighbors stirred, lights flickered on in bedroom windows, and phones rang through the night. But by the time anyone stepped outside, the street was empty. No struggle, no figure, just the uneasy quiet of a summer night. The town of nearly 3,000 souls would wake to the kind of nightmare that transforms a community forever. A young woman was missing. Her car sat abandoned by the roadside, keys still inside, as though she had simply vanished into the night air. In a place where people rarely locked their doors and trusted one another as kin, the sudden absence was like a rip in the fabric of daily life. Something unthinkable had happened, and no one knew where to look or who to fear. The scene itself was chilling in its ordinariness. A stretch of asphalt winding past pine trees, cicadas buzzing beneath the stars, the faint glow of porch lights scattered down the road. It looked harmless, familiar, and yet here something violent had occurred. Police combed the area by flashlight, their beams cutting through the humid air, revealing only fragments. Tire tracks fading into dust, a footprint half swallowed by gravel, the faint drag of fabric in the dirt. None of it explained the sudden silence that followed the scream. As dawn broke, whispers began to spread. Families gathered on porches, eyes fixed on patrol cars crawling slowly past. Mothers pulled children close. Fathers checked locks twice, then a third time. For a town that prided itself on safety, the fear felt foreign and suffocating. By sunrise, what began as a missing person report was already mutating into something darker, a mystery wrapped in terror, with no clear answers. And yet there was one truth that everyone, from the sheriff to the oldest townsfolk, could feel in their bones. This wasn't just someone running away or a misunderstanding. Something violent had happened, something final. What no one knew, not then, was how long that night would cast its shadow. For the family of the young woman, every day after would be shaped by absence. Birthdays uncelebrated, holidays marked by empty chairs. For investigators, it would become an open wound, a case that resisted every lead, every theory. And for the town itself, it became a ghost story whispered in diners and passed down in hushed tones. The girl who never came home. 30 years would pass before the scream of that night finally found an answer. 30 years of questions, of rumors, of detectives chasing shadows. And when the truth did come, it landed like a thunderclap, shocking not only the victim's family but the entire state of Alabama. For 3 decades, one question haunted them all. Who killed her? The answer, as it turned out, was far closer than anyone ever dared imagine. She was 22 years old, with a smile that lit up the corners of every room she entered. Friends described her as gentle, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who stayed late to help close the diner, who never left a conversation without asking how you were doing. Her name was spoken with fondness in that Alabama town, not because she sought attention, but because she seemed to embody the warmth of the community itself. She had grown up just a few blocks from where her car would later be found. The streets were familiar, lined with neat rows of modest houses, each with their own history and family stories. Summers were thick with the smell of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. On Friday nights, high school football drew the town together, the stadium lights cutting through the dark like a beacon. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where lives intertwined across generations. And yet, even in towns like this, shadows lurk. There were corners of memory and rumor, old grudges, secrets kept behind closed doors. For all its charm, the town was no stranger to hardship. People struggled quietly, jobs lost at the mill, marriages that didn't last, young men who drank too much. Against this backdrop, the victim's life shone brighter. She was planning for more. A future she would never get to see. On the day she disappeared, she had finished her shift at the local diner just before 11 p.m. The regulars had seen her clearing tables, wiping down counters, laughing softly with a co-worker about weekend plans. She wore her uniform still when she walked out into the warm Alabama night. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear. Nothing hinted at what was waiting for her. Her family remembered that evening vividly. Her mother left a porch light on, as she always did, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the screen door creaking open. Hours passed. The light burned on, attracting moths and beetles, but the door never opened. By morning, Dread had begun to bloom inside that modest family home. In towns like this, people didn't vanish. That was the kind of story you heard about in far-off cities, the kind of tragedy that belonged to the nightly news. Here, life was simple, predictable, until suddenly it wasn't. Neighbors would later recall how surreal it felt to see her smiling face on missing person posters taped to storefronts, to hear her name called out during prayer services at church, to drive past her empty car, parked like a monument to absence, and feel a chill settle in their stomachs. She wasn't just another statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a life interrupted, with dreams of marriage, children, and a home of her own. That future ended under the glow of a streetlight on Pine Road, the last place she was ever seen alive. And though the town would cling to hope, clinging to the idea that maybe she had run, maybe she had escaped, a deeper truth whispered through the community. Something terrible had happened, but the full weight of that truth wouldn't be felt until the night itself was retraced, moment by moment, revealing how quickly ordinary hours turned into tragedy. The evening of her disappearance began like so many others. It was Friday, the close of a long week, and the diner buzzed with the usual hum of conversation. Coffee cups clinked, the jukebox played faintly in the corner, and the smell of fried chicken lingered in the air. She laughed with co-workers as she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and hung it on the hook by the back door. At 10:47 p.m., she walked out into the warm Alabama night. That timestamp would later echo through police reports like the tolling of a clock. By 11 ash, she was behind the wheel of her car, a modest sedan that carried her faithfully down Pine Road countless times before. The route home was short, no more than 10 minutes. She had driven it hundreds of times. Tonight it should have been uneventful. But sometime between 11:05 and 11:15, everything went wrong. A neighbor later recalled hearing a sound, sharp, high-pitched, almost like a scream, cutting through the stillness. Dogs barked. Porch lights flicked on. For a moment it seemed as though the entire block held its breath. Then silence fell again, thicker than before. When officers arrived hours later, her car was still there, parked neatly on the roadside, as though waiting for her return. The keys were in the ignition. A handbag lay on the passenger seat. Nothing was stolen. Nothing appeared forced. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Flashlights swept across gravel shoulders and into the brush. Investigators noted a set of footprints veering off toward the trees, but they stopped abruptly in loose soil, as though swallowed whole. No signs of struggle were clear, no drag marks, no blood. Only hints, fragments, suggestions that something unseen had unfolded in those few minutes of darkness. By midnight, her mother was awake, pacing the living room, watching the porch light glow like a beacon. By 2 a.m., her father was calling friends, asking if anyone had seen her. By dawn, police were knocking on doors, waking neighbors, asking questions that carried a rising urgency. Did you hear anything? Did you see anyone? The chilling part wasn't just the disappearance itself. It was the swiftness. One moment, she was driving home along a quiet road she knew by heart. The next, her presence had been erased, leaving behind only the ordinary objects of her life, the car, the keys, the purse, like pieces of a puzzle without a picture. For the town, the clock stopped that night. Every passing hour deepened the mystery. Every detail seemed both significant and meaningless, a cruel riddle carved into the landscape. And as the first 24 hours passed without answers, investigators understood a truth that would haunt them. The trail was already slipping away. The questions loomed like storm clouds over Pine Road. Who had stopped her? Where had she gone? And how could someone disappear so completely in a place where everyone knew everyone else? The search had only just begun. But already it was beginning to unravel. The first 72 hours are always the most critical in a disappearance. In this case, they slipped by in a blur of panic, confusion, and missed chances. By the morning after, patrol cars crawled through every street, their sirens off, but their presence heavy. Officers knocked on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Neighbors repeated what little they had. I thought I heard something. I saw headlights where there shouldn't have been. But the fragments didn't fit together. Rumors multiplied faster than evidence. Volunteers joined the search, combing through fields, ditches, and wooded lots. Men with flashlights scoured barns and sheds. Women handed out sandwiches and coffee, as if the act of feeding searchers could somehow summon the missing woman back home. The county sheriff stood before reporters on the courthouse steps, promising answers. His words carried confidence, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Dogs were brought in to track her scent. They sniffed the roadside, circled the abandoned car, and tugged toward the tree line. For a moment, hope surged. But then the trail went cold, the dogs pacing in restless confusion. The silence of the woods seemed almost deliberate, as if nature itself was hiding the truth. False leads piled up. Someone claimed they had seen her in a nearby town. It proved to be another woman. Another tip suggested a suspicious truck circling the diner that night. When tracked down, it belonged to a local farmer with a broken tail light. Each tip consumed precious hours. Each dead end deepened the sense of helplessness. By the second night, helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights sweeping across farmland and rivers. The roar of the blades carried through the town like a grim lullaby. Families huddled inside their homes, curtains drawn, while children whispered about monsters in the dark. Inside the sheriff's office, a war room took shape, maps pinned with colored markers, photographs spread across tables, timelines scribbled in ink. Detectives debated theories late into the night. Some believed she had been abducted by a stranger passing through. Others suspected someone local. The lack of forced entry into her car, the absence of theft, suggested something personal. But no suspect emerged. As hours stretched into days, the tension suffocated the town. Journalists arrived, broadcasting headlines that transformed a private tragedy into statewide news. Cameras flashed at vigils, capturing the tear-streaked faces of family members begging for her safe return. The more the cameras rolled, the more pressure weighed on investigators. Yet beneath the noise, beneath the chaos of volunteers, reporters, and rumor, one truth gnawed at the core of the investigation. There was no clear trail. No body, no weapon, just absence. By the third night, the sheriff admitted what everyone feared. The case was already turning cold. In a town where everyone knew everyone, the disappearance was more than a crime. It was a rupture in the fabric of daily life. Fear seeped into every corner, transforming ordinary conversations into whispered speculations. At the grocery store, checkout clerks spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to strangers who lingered too long in line. At church, prayers for the missing woman echoed under the stained glass windows. But when the service ended, the congregation spilled into the parking lot and exchanged theories that bordered on accusations. "I heard she was having troubles at home," someone murmured. "Didn't her car look staged?" Another suggested. The local diner became the epicenter of speculation. Coffee cups clinked against saucers as farmers, truckers, and housewives dissected every rumor. Some swore they had seen suspicious headlights on the highway. Others insisted the woman had planned to run away. The waitress, tired of hearing the same stories repeated, simply refilled mugs and shook her head. Every day the gossip grew darker. Families began locking their doors, a practice once considered unnecessary in this quiet county. Children were warned not to walk home alone from school. Women started traveling in pairs, even for simple errands. The sense of safety that had once defined small-town life was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. Suspicion turned inward. Old grudges resurfaced. A farmer who lived near the woods was whispered about because his truck matched the vague description from an anonymous caller. A mechanic, known for his temper, found himself at the center of town gossip after being spotted at the sheriff's office, though he was only there to renew his gun license. Even family members weren't spared. Some questioned whether the husband had told the full story, while others pointed fingers at distant relatives who hadn't been seen in years. The media amplified the paranoia. Headlines painted the town as a place haunted by shadows. News anchors hinted at secrets buried in plain sight. The outside world now saw the town not as a safe rural community, but as a stage for tragedy. Vigils were held in the town square. Candles flickered against the night air, forming small islands of light in the darkness. Songs were sung, hands were held, and tears flowed openly. Yet even at these gatherings of solidarity, whispers persisted. The candles were meant to symbolize hope, but to many they also highlighted the fact that hope was fading. By the end of the second week, the town was no longer united in grief. it was divided by suspicion. Every glance seemed loaded with meaning. Every conversation felt like an interrogation. And in the heart of it all, one truth lingered unspoken. If someone among them was responsible, then the danger was not outside the community, it was within it. When the dust of the first frantic search began to settle, the investigation shifted from frantic rescue to cold suspicion. If the woman had not simply wandered away, then someone close had taken her. And in small-town Alabama, close narrowed the list quickly. The husband was the first shadow on the detectives' board. Statistically, it was almost always the spouse. He had discovered her missing. He had made the call, and yet something about his demeanor unsettled those watching. Too calm, some said. Too precise in his timeline, others argued. Investigators noted the absence of visible grief, cataloging his every gesture. But beyond suspicion, they found no evidence. His alibi was solid. He had been seen at work until late that evening. His co-workers vouched for him. Still, the whispers persisted. Next came the neighbor, a man who lived only 2 houses down. He had been the last to hear the scream that cut through the midnight air. But when questioned, his account shifted. First, he claimed it was a fox. Then he admitted it could have been human. Investigators pressed harder, but again, no hard proof. Just uncertainty. Just contradiction. The sheriff's department began to dig into the woman's private life. Had she been seeing someone? Was there an affair hidden behind closed curtains? A local mechanic's name surfaced. He had fixed her car weeks before, and some townsfolk whispered that he lingered too long at her doorstep. But interviews gave no traction. The man denied any connection, and his wife stood firmly by his side, defending his every word. Theories multiplied faster than facts. Some were rooted in possibility. Others veered into the fantastic. One caller swore she had seen a black sedan circling the neighborhood, its lights off. Another insisted the missing woman had been planning to flee, running from debts, secrets, or a lover unknown. Each tip piled onto the detectives' desks, most going nowhere. Forensic teams combed through the house again. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, only a single overturned lamp, which could have been anything or everything. The crime scene was as silent as the night it happened. Then came the darker theories. Could it have been a drifter, someone just passing through? The highways were only miles away, offering easy access in and out. But the timing, the precision, made it unlikely. This felt personal. This felt deliberate. For weeks, the sheriff's office followed each lead, circling back again and again to the same few names. The husband, the neighbor, the mechanic. Each was scrutinized, interrogated, even shadowed in their daily lives. But nothing broke open. Nothing fit completely. And as the months dragged on, the case began to cool. Theories remained, but answers did not. The list of suspects blurred into rumor, and rumor hardened into legend. Still, one fact remained chillingly clear. Someone had taken her. Someone knew what happened, and that someone was still out there. As weeks turned into months, the urgency that once electrified the town began to fade into something colder, heavier. Leads that had once glimmered like sparks went out one by one, each extinguished with the suffocating finality of paperwork, stamped unfounded. Detectives followed the black sedan rumor until it collapsed. Highway patrols found nothing. No car, no driver, no trail. The alleged lover. Nothing but whispers. The mechanic returned to his garage, his life dissected by gossip but untouched by proof. Even the neighbor, once a focal point of suspicion, was cleared after polygraph tests and repeated questioning. The investigation ground into silence. Files piled up in cardboard boxes. Tape recordings gathered dust. Evidence bags sat in storage, their labels fading under fluorescent light. For the sheriff's department, the woman's case became just one of many unsolved mysteries haunting Alabama's backroads. For her family, it was an open wound that refused to heal. Her mother never stopped calling. Every week she rang the sheriff's office, begging for an update, her voice cracking under the weight of repetition. Sometimes she brought cookies for the deputies, hoping kindness would keep her daughter's case alive in their minds. Sometimes she brought tears, reminding them of the stakes. But more often than not, she left with nothing, just promises and silence. The town, too, began to fracture under the weight of the unknown. Neighbors who once gathered to search together now eyed each other warily. Who could have done this? Was the killer living among them still, blending into church pews and grocery lines? Rumors turned neighbors into suspects. Gossip became poison. Years slipped by. Seasons cycled. Christmases came and went without her. Birthdays passed, candles unlit, empty chairs at family tables, and still no arrest. No confession. Only questions that carved deeper scars with time. Detectives rotated out. New faces entered the department, inheriting the cold case file like a cursed relic. Each opened the box of evidence with determination. Each eventually set it aside, defeated. Forensic science in the 1980s and 1990s offered little beyond fingerprints and fibers, and there were no fingerprints, no clear fibers, nothing that spoke, and so silence hardened into despair. For the victim's family, hope was no longer a bright flame but a dim ember, flickering only on anniversaries reignited by television appeals or newspaper retrospectives. For the town, the case became a ghost story, whispered to children as a warning, "Don't stay out too late. Remember what happened on Elm Street." But beneath the layers of dust, one truth lingered. The evidence had not disappeared. The answers had not vanished. They were there, buried in the file boxes, in the forgotten samples, in the silent gaps of testimony. All that was missing was someone willing to look again, and decades later, when technology finally caught up, someone would. Grief has no expiration date. For the victim's family, time did not heal. It only deepened the wound. In those first months after her disappearance, hope had carried them. They believed every phone call from detectives might bring news. Every knock on the door might be her. But as the years passed, hope turned into something crueler, a constant reminder of what had been stolen and how powerless they were to reclaim it. Her mother aged in the shadow of absence. Neighbors remembered seeing her sit on the porch at dusk, staring down the street as though expecting her daughter to walk home. She kept the bedroom untouched. Clothes folded, perfume bottles on the dresser, a stack of favorite magazines on the nightstand, frozen in time. Dust gathered, but she refused to disturb anything. To her, the room was both a shrine and a silent scream. The siblings, too, carried the silence differently. One became angry, snapping at anyone who suggested they move on. Another turned inward, barely speaking about her at all, afraid that words would make the loss too real. Family gatherings grew quieter. Her absence was always there, louder than laughter, heavier than prayer. Milestones that should have been joyous became reminders of loss. Weddings without her as maid of honor, birthdays without her laughter, holidays with one chair that remained empty year after year. And as friends moved on, started families, built new lives, the victim's family remained anchored to that night in Alabama. Frozen in a grief the rest of the world had stopped noticing, the toll extended beyond the home, bills mounted from private investigators hired in desperation. The mother even appeared on local television, clutching a framed photograph, her voice trembling as she begged, "Please, if you know anything, come forward." The broadcast replayed dozens of times, but no answers came. Each failed plea hollowed her further. Even faith began to fracture. In a state where church was the heart of community, the family found themselves drifting away from pews, unable to reconcile their prayers with the silence that followed. Some parishioners avoided them, unsure of what to say. Others whispered, blaming the husband, the neighbors, the very people the family once leaned on for comfort. Isolation grew. The victim's absence became more than a loss. It became a curse the family carried into every corner of their lives. And as the decades crawled on, they wondered, would the truth ever come? Would justice ever arrive? Or would their daughter's name fade into nothing more than a line in a dusty sheriff's ledger? But grief has a way of keeping memory alive, even when the world forgets. And though the years battered them, they never stopped asking, never stopped waiting. What they could not know, what they could not even imagine, was that time itself would one day turn in their favor. A quiet miracle of science was on the horizon, one that would breathe life into a case that had been buried in silence. It was the kind of case that had long been filed away, buried under dust and forgotten boxes. But in the early 2000s, a quiet revolution was transforming law enforcement. DNA technology, once a fledgling science, was now becoming the sharpest tool in a detective's arsenal. And across the country, cold case units were opening their vaults, dragging old evidence into the light of modern labs. In Alabama, One young investigator refused to let the file stay closed. He wasn't part of the original team, but he'd grown up hearing whispers of the mystery. To him, it wasn't just another cold case. It was a haunting injustice, one that deserved another look. He began with the evidence boxes. Inside, brittle reports typed on yellowing paper, cassette tapes with muffled interviews, and bags sealed with tape that had begun to curl at the edges. Most of it seemed ordinary, but buried beneath the folders was something that still held potential. A scrap of fabric, a strand of hair, tiny biological traces that earlier decades had overlooked. The detective sent them to the state crime lab. Weeks passed. Then came the call. A partial DNA profile had been developed. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to be compared against the ever-expanding national database. When the results came back, hope stirred for the first time in 30 years. There was a match, or at least a lead. A name surfaced, faint but undeniable. It didn't belong to the husband. It didn't belong to the neighbor. It didn't belong to the mechanic the town had whispered about for decades. It belonged to someone else. Someone close enough to have been overlooked. Someone the community had never truly suspected. The news spread quietly through the department. Detectives huddled in narrow offices, reviewing maps, timelines, and old interview transcripts. Suddenly, threads that had once seemed frayed began to weave together. Witness statements that never quite aligned now made sense. Evidence that once felt inconclusive now pointed with terrifying clarity. And for the family, the call they had been waiting for all those years finally came. The sheriff's office informed them that new DNA testing had reignited the case. For the mother, now elderly, her voice faint but unbroken, it was a bittersweet moment. Hope hurt almost as much as despair. "Please," she whispered, "don't let this end like the others." But this time was different. This time the science was irrefutable. And as detectives closed in on the man whose name had surfaced from the shadows, the town would soon learn a chilling truth. The killer had not been a stranger passing through. He had been among them, living freely while the family mourned. The breakthrough was only the beginning. The arrest, the unmasking of a man who had carried a secret for 3 decades, was yet to come. When the name surfaced from the DNA test, it struck like a thunderclap. Not an outsider, not a drifter, not the husband or the neighbor or the mechanic who had lived under decades of suspicion. The match pointed to someone quieter, someone ordinary, someone the community had trusted. He had lived in the same county for years, building a life in plain sight. He attended church. He held steady work. He smiled at neighbors in the grocery store aisles. And yet all that time, he carried a secret as dark as the Alabama night that swallowed the victim decades earlier. Detectives combed back through the old records, and the pieces began to align with chilling precision. He had been interviewed in the early days, but only in passing. His story was unremarkable, his demeanor calm. He slipped through the cracks because he didn't fit the image of a predator. He was too ordinary, too careful. But the science could not be denied. The DNA recovered from the evidence tied him directly to the crime scene. It was the missing piece that years of rumor and speculation had failed to uncover. No more guessing, no more theories, just proof. Investigators began surveillance, quietly monitoring his routines. They documented his work schedule, his home, the cars he drove. They noted how easily he blended into the rhythm of small-town life. Watching him, they felt the weight of the years. The realization that while a family grieved, this man had lived freely, unburdened by guilt, unmarked by suspicion. When the time came, detectives devised a plan. They would confront him, but not until they had everything locked down. Warrants were prepared. Interviews were reviewed. The victim's family was warned. The answers they had waited for might finally be within reach. And when they approached him, the man did not rage. He did not panic. He was calm, eerily calm. The kind of calm that only comes from someone who has rehearsed denial for 30 years. But DNA doesn't lie. The suspect's name hit the news like a shockwave. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now recoiled, wondering how they could have lived beside him all this time. Churchgoers remembered his quiet presence in the pews. Co-workers recalled his easy smile. And suddenly, all those ordinary details felt sinister. For the family, the revelation was both vindication and agony. They had an answer at last. But the truth carried a new weight. The killer had been there all along, and as the case moved toward arrest, one haunting question lingered. How had he managed to hide in plain sight for so long? The answer would emerge only when the cuffs finally closed around his wrists. It was early morning when unmarked cars rolled quietly through the Alabama neighborhood. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting long shadows across the lawns. Residents peeked through curtains as detectives in plain clothes approached a modest house. 30 years of waiting were about to end. The knock on the suspect's door was firm, deliberate. Inside, he answered with the same calm that had once fooled investigators. But this time there was no escape. A warrant in hand, officers at his back. His life of freedom, built on decades of silence, was over. Neighbors watched as he was led out in handcuffs, his face blank, expressionless. For some the sight was shattering. For others it was vindication, proof that their whispers and suspicions had not been in vain. Cameras clicked. News crews swarmed. The name that had once meant nothing now became synonymous with betrayal. At the sheriff's office the interrogation began. At first he denied everything, his voice steady, his story unchanging. He was not there. He had no part in it. For hours detectives pushed, circling back again and again. They laid the DNA results on the table, the irrefutable science that tied him to the crime, and cracks began to show. His denials softened, grew hesitant. The calm exterior slipped. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting away from the evidence he could not refute. Finally, after decades of silence, the words spilled out. Not a confession of guilt in the moral sense, but an admission that could not be taken back. He had been there. He had taken her. The room fell silent after the admission. The detectives, hardened by years of work, felt the gravity of the moment. 3 decades of unanswered questions collapsed into a single truth. The man before them was the killer. For the victim's family, the news delivered a storm of emotions. Relief, anger, grief, all at once. They had begged for this moment, prayed for it. And yet hearing the details was almost unbearable. To know how their daughter's final moments unfolded. To picture her face in those last hours. Justice brought answers, but answers cut deep. The community, too, reeled. For years the crime had been a phantom, a ghost story. Now it had a face, a name, a neighbor, someone who had lived among them, free, while fear and grief consumed others. The arrest shook their trust in the very fabric of their town. The trial preparations began swiftly. Prosecutors assembled their case, built upon DNA, confessions, and the long trail of silence that had finally unraveled. And for the first time in 30 years, the victim's name returned to headlines, not as a mystery but as the center of a fight for justice. The man who had once hidden in plain sight was finally behind bars. And though the trial was yet to come, one truth was undeniable. The silence of decades had been broken. When the guilty verdict was finally read in an Alabama courtroom, the silence was deafening. For 30 years, the victim's name had been synonymous with loss, with questions that seemed destined never to be answered. Now there was resolution. A man who had hidden behind normalcy for decades would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Justice at last had been delivered. For the family, the verdict was both a salve and a blade. They had begged for answers for so long, and now they had them. But answers came with details that seared into memory. The final moments of a daughter, sister, loved one. Her mother, frail but unyielding, told reporters outside the courthouse, "We waited 30 years for this day. It doesn't bring her back, but at least we know the truth." The town, too, was left changed. For decades, suspicion had poisoned neighbors against one another. Innocent men, the husband, the neighbor, the mechanic, had lived under clouds of doubt. With the truth revealed, their names were finally cleared, but scars remained. The whispers that had lingered in church pews and grocery aisles would never be fully erased, and yet the case carried lessons beyond its borders. It was a testament to the endurance of grief, the persistence of investigators, and the power of science to bridge decades of silence. What once seemed impossible had been made possible by strands of DNA too small to see, evidence too fragile to matter in the 1980s, but powerful enough to close a case in the 2000s. For the detectives who carried the file through its darkest years, the resolution was personal. Some had retired long before the breakthrough, never knowing that the answers were waiting in a lab. Others had devoted years to chasing false leads, haunted by the sense of failure. Now they could breathe, even if only a little. The case that defined their careers was no longer a question mark, but the greatest impact was on memory. For 3 decades, the victim's story had been told as an open wound, unfinished, unresolved. Now it could be told differently, not just as a tale of loss, but as a testament to perseverance. Her life was no longer defined by the night it ended, but by the love of a family who never stopped fighting for her. Still, in the quiet corners of Alabama, the echoes remain. The empty bedroom, preserved for decades, the porch light left on year after year, waiting for someone who would never return. The community still remembers, because tragedies like these do not vanish with a verdict. They linger, reshaping the way people trust, the way they hope, the way they fear. And so the story closes, but not neatly. Justice came late, painfully late. Healing came, but never fully. What remains is a reminder: time does not erase the truth. It only waits silent until someone is willing to find it.